Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining us today for the release of our study, The State of Nonprofits in Southeast Louisiana 2021, Adaptability and Racial Equity in Year 1 of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's great to see everybody, and I am super excited to be welcoming you to this event today. As you know, the Greater New Orleans Foundation has as its mission to drive positive impact through leadership, philanthropy, and action in the Greater New Orleans region. And for nearly 100 years, we've connected our donors and fund holders with the causes about which they are passionate. But we do more than fund management and grant making. We also train boards and nonprofit leaders so that they can be more effective and have greater impact. We put on Give NOLA Day each May, and we undertake civic leadership projects within the Greater New Orleans region to help address our region's biggest challenges and the biggest challenges that are facing the places and the people we love, so that we can improve people's lives that are here today, tomorrow, and for generations to come. In order to fulfill our mission, it's important that we take stock of the nonprofit sector from time to time to ensure that it is not only providing the best services to our people, but also identifying gaps that we need to address. This study is our second in 2 years, and it takes a deep dive into the health of the nonprofit sector, specifically looking at how nonprofits adapted to the COVID-19 pandemic, and also looking at whether we are making progress in achieving greater racial equity in our region and identifying where gaps may exist. To those of us who work closely with nonprofits in our region, it comes as no surprise that our study shows how resilient and adaptable those nonprofits were when the pandemic hit. They rose to the occasion, time and time again, scrambling to stay afloat financially, to work virtually in some cases, and so many rallied to serve our communities on the front lines in this time of enormous need. So many organizations even expanded their services and grew their revenues in response to the pandemic in order to do their best work at meeting the community's needs. It's also important for us to acknowledge that at a time when we face the impact of the deadly pandemic on our lives and our livelihoods, we were also faced with an important obligation and opportunity to re-examine how we address our region's and our nation's history of racial injustice. The events of last year called on all of us to ask ourselves the hard questions and to take an honest assessment of where we are and where we should and need to be. I've thought a lot about our unique responsibilities as residents of the Greater New Orleans region, as well as about the opportunity we have as a region to be leaders for our nation in diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a community, we always do better when everyone is at the table. We do better when we eliminate barriers and take actions to make sure that everyone has the chance to achieve their dreams and their potential. We do better when we look out for one another and proactively create pathways and opportunities for those who for too long have had their paths blocked. We do better when all of us are able to thrive. So quite simply, in order for Greater New Orleans region to lead, we must work to make sure that we become the best versions of ourselves and our organizations become the best versions of themselves that we can be. And to do this, diversity, equity, and inclusion must be embedded in every aspect of what we do. We must continue to remind ourselves that diversity is in fact that which makes us stronger. So today we are excited to hear from the study's authors, as well as from nonprofit leaders who are on the ground. Their discussion will highlight the study's findings, as well as offer insights on how the nonprofit community can continue to make progress through this difficult time, and that we can all come out stronger on the other side. Before we get to the discussion, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the folks on our team who have worked very hard to make today's event possible. So thanks first to the authors of our study. First, our Vice President of Programs for the Greater New Orleans Foundation, Kelly Chavez Green, as well as UNO Professor, Dr. Stephen Mumford. So thank you to the authors. I also want to thank the many nonprofit partners who participated in the study. We literally had hundreds of responses. You all gave us the much needed data that we'll discuss today. The Greater New Orleans Funders Network also provided important financial support, which made this study possible. So thank you to the Greater New Orleans Funders Network. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees and our entire staff at the Greater New Orleans Foundation, let me personally thank you for your partnership with us so that together we can make a greater impact on our community. Now I'd like to thank and also ask you to please join me in welcoming our Vice President of Programs and the architect of this study, Kelly Chavez-Green. Kelly?
Thank you, Andy. I'm so excited to be with you today to share the results of our study, The State of Nonprofits in Southeast Louisiana in 2021, Adaptability and Racial Equity in Year 1 of the COVID-19 pandemic. With me today is Dr. Steve Mumford, professor at UNO in Political Science Department and the lead researcher for the study. We are also joined by Judy Reese-Morris, president and CEO for the Urban League of Louisiana, and Elise Galnot-Goldman, executive director with kitsmart. We'll start the webinar with some information on the nonprofit sector and what it looks like here in Southeast Louisiana. Then we'll transition into the study, how we got here and what we learned. We'll hear about some of the key findings from Dr. Mumford, and Judy and Elise will share how the data reflects their experience leading a nonprofit. For many, the nonprofit sector is a mystery, even though most of us have experienced it in some shape or fashion. Nonprofits have long provided for the basic needs of our community, such as food, shelter, and healthcare. They help us teach our children and care for our elders. They produce and share the outstanding art, music, and culture for which our region is so well known. Nonprofit organizations are businesses, often referred to as mission-driven businesses that serve a public good. Many of them depend on earned revenue like ticket sales and service contracts to balance their budget. The difference between nonprofit businesses and for-profit businesses is that they don't have owners. Instead, they are governed by a volunteer board of directors. Nonprofits can actually earn a profit. However, these profits don't enrich individuals. Instead, they are invested back into the nonprofit to deliver on its mission. Nonprofits are incorporated in the state and registered with the IRS so that they can be exempt from most taxes and to provide tax deductions to their donors. Nonprofit organizations are distinct from government, although they often partner with it. However, many of their political activities are limited by law. There are more than 1.5 million nonprofits registered through the IRS in the United States. There was rapid growth of this sector in the 1990s, due in part to outsourcing of services that had been previously provided by government, as well as increases in giving and volunteering over the years. And in our region, the size of the nonprofit sector expanded after Hurricane Katrina, but also began to contract in later years when funding for disasters dried up. Nonprofits employ over 10% of the workforce nationwide and closer to 12% in our region, or about 60,000 workers. Nonprofits pay more total wages than retail and construction industries, including $3 billion in annual total wages in the Greater New Orleans region, at above annual salaries. Nonprofits in Southeast Louisiana raised more than $13 billion in total revenues and held more than $18 billion in total assets in recent years. Think about it: hospitals, universities, and charter schools, but also a variety of other human service, education, and arts nonprofits of all sizes. Now let's dive into the study. Our partnership with UNO's Political Science Department and Dr. Mumford has been since 2019, when we were planning for a very comprehensive study of the region's nonprofits. We developed a 50-question survey that was designed to capture a wide range of information on the nonprofit sector. We disseminated the survey on March 11th, 2020, just 2 days before the governor closed the schools due to the COVID-19 pandemic. At that point, we knew the survey as designed was no longer relevant, so we pulled it, reduced it to 10 questions, focusing on the impact of the pandemic. That first study on nonprofits' immediate needs during the pandemic was released in June 2020. We learned a lot about the operational disruptions nonprofits were facing in that study, also how nonprofits adapted and the role that they were playing in the response to the pandemic. But it also left us with a lot of questions about the future, and we still didn't have a good understanding of who was leading the sector, both at the executive and board level. After many months of planning with additional partners and a diverse advisory group of nonprofit leaders in our region, in January and February 2021, we disseminated a more comprehensive survey aimed at addressing two sets of research questions. How have our region's nonprofits adapted to the pandemic? What toll did it take on them, and what opportunities emerged? And the second question, what is the state of racial equity in our region's nonprofits? How do funding opportunities and outcomes differ based on the racial identity of the leaders? Over the next several months, Dr. Mumford and a team of 3 Palmas scholars from UNO conducted outreach to ensure a good response rate. They coded the open-ended questions and carefully analyzed the survey data. Our advisory group kept us grounded and offered critical feedback on our interpretation of the results. We also benefited from thought partnership and financial support for the study from the Greater New Orleans Funders Network. Now I am thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Mumford to tell you about the nonprofits that participated in the study and then to share some of the key findings.
Thank you, Kelly. It has been an absolute honor to lead this study in partnership with the Greater New Orleans Foundation and learn about the impressive strengths, but also the critical needs of our region's nonprofits during these particularly challenging times. The online survey was sent to about 750 public charities in a 13-parish region of Southeast Louisiana, which spans from the North Shore all the way to the coast. 335 nonprofits responded for a 45% response rate, which is an incredible show of support for the study at any time, let alone in the midst of a disaster. We sent the survey to 501c3 public charities that are actively registered with the IRS in recent years, because the IRS is where we pulled most of our information from. And we excluded some particularly large nonprofits like hospitals, schools, universities, as well as religious congregations, because they're not required to register with the government. In the end, our survey sample was very representative of the overall sector in the region, with the possible exception of nonprofits with the smallest budgets, because again, their public records are very limited. We therefore believe strongly in the credibility of our data, particularly for human service and arts and culture nonprofits that combined comprise the majority of our sector. Now on to the key findings. First, in terms of adapting to the pandemic, by last winter when we conducted the survey, more than 3/4 of nonprofits were continuing to operate virtually, and just over half were operating out of their office at that point. Many nonprofits still had a ways to go to get back to fully operating in person again. In part because they could still not hold many in-person programs and events, more than half of nonprofits in the region lost funding during the pandemic. Arts and culture nonprofits were even more likely to lose funding. On the other hand, about 1/5 of nonprofits were able to increase their budgets during the pandemic through new funding sources like grants and the federal Paycheck Protection Program forgivable loans that were available to all businesses of a certain size. Nonprofits providing essential human services in response to the pandemic were more likely to increase their funding during the pandemic. To cope with budget cuts, many nonprofits had to cut back on staff or delay their hires. This is especially, again, true of arts and culture nonprofits. Almost half of them reduced staff during the pandemic to save on operational costs, while much of their programming was paused. In fact, overall, our sector lost 10% of its workforce, and arts and culture nonprofits lost closer to 17%. Those regional nonprofit job losses mirror the national data. PPP loans helped avoid even more layoffs, but clearly nonprofits had to adapt their programming and their budgets to make ends meet. So I'll pause here and pass it back to Kelly and our guests to share their experiences adapting to the pandemic.
Kelly, I think you're muted.
Apologies for that. Thank you, Elise. I was just sharing that the data did show that our region's nonprofit creatively adapted and largely held tight through the first year of COVID-19 pandemic. As Steve said, the Paycheck Protection had a lot to do with stabilizing the nonprofit sector. And at the foundation, we responded by providing training and technical assistance to help nonprofits access the PPP. We've also hosted almost 50 webinars on topics such as human resources and planning virtual events to help nonprofit leaders navigate the operational disruptions resulting from the pandemic. Judy, let's start with you. How did the Urban League of Louisiana adapt its programming, and how did the pandemic impact your budget?
Hi, good afternoon, Kelly. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. I also want to say thank you to my dear friend, Andy Copland, for his leadership of the Greater New Orleans Foundation and the focus that he has placed on racial equity. For those of you who are not familiar, the Urban League of Louisiana is a civil rights and social justice organization headquartered in New Orleans, serving the entire state of Louisiana. Our mission is to promote economic self-reliance, civil rights, social justice, and racial equity for African Americans and for others. Our focus is on programming and policy and advocacy. And through that work, we touch education and youth development, workforce, entrepreneurship, and a long list of policy issues, all related to creating an environment so that African Americans and others are able to thrive. We coined a phrase at the start of the pandemic, and it actually became our theme for the year 2020, and it is, we don't pause, we pivot. We know that when it's cold outside, the communities that we serve are colder, and many are already reeling from the disparities that cause them to be on the wrong end of the disparity gaps. So we knew at the Urban League that we had to figure out pretty quickly how to continue to engage our participants and clients, and to do it in a way that aligned with the governor's mandate. We moved as quickly as possible to turn everything that we do into a virtual offering. Whether it was our Office of Workforce that very quickly, after the start of the pandemic, produced a virtual job fair. Many people thought that we were nuts to think about doing a job fair when the world was shutting down, but we will all remember the need for essential workers and essential services. And so we took to a virtual platform to match employers with job seekers to help to fill some of that very, very critical void at that time on both ends, for the employer and for the job seeker. On the entrepreneurship front, our Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation had a lot of people to educate, small business owners who did not understand the very, very confusing and ever-changing regulations that were coming down from the federal government about the loan opportunities and other opportunities available for small businesses. And so we had to help our small businesses understand what those requirements were and to support them in getting themselves ready so that they could apply for the PPP and for the EIDL and other types of assistance. On the education front, we run a Head Start Center in the Upper Ninth Ward. We serve 62 families. We are at full capacity, but we also serve parents across the state through policy and advocacy. And so we had to work with parents to make sure that they understood what virtual learning was all about, what that would mean for their their children and grandchildren and other family members. Many of them did not have internet to have access to the internet. So we had to work with partners to get computers and hotspots to make sure that they could connect, not just for virtual learning, but to make sure that they were tapped in and connected to information about the pandemic. And then on the policy and social justice front, Kelly, we had to make sure that we could continue our efforts around the 2020 census. We were deep into that work. We began in 2019, but we all know the importance of participation in the census, particularly for communities of color. So we had to ensure that we were able to continue to engage our communities across Louisiana to make sure that they understood that it was still important, even in the midst of this new thing called the pandemic, that they had to still participate in the census. We also had to try to be innovative and be responsive to what was happening. Huge shift around finally in this country paying attention to racial equity and the history of race in America. And so putting a spotlight on the importance of understanding what that means. We got so many calls at the Urban League asking us for our thoughts and our opinions and recommendations about what people could do as individuals, as well as what they could do as leaders of organizations. So we decided to put together a 6-module, 6-month course called Racial Equity Process, Building Your Infrastructure to Support Racial Equity Within Your Organizations. Everything from auditing your organization all the way to building a strategic racial equity framework so that organizations can practice racial equity every day. So we did all of this work to make sure that we could continue to serve on the programming side, as well as provide any new services or information that the public needed during this challenging time. And Kelly, I'll tell you that we were able to maintain support from our funders by making this pivot, by pivoting to virtual and trying to be innovative and responsive to the times. But it was not easy. I cannot tell you how difficult and challenging it was for the incredible team at the Urban League of Louisiana in New Orleans and in Baton Rouge. Many of the issues that we've talked about are many of the issues that we ourselves are dealing with. And so to have to stay on and focused and make sure that we not only continue to do what we had done before the start of the pandemic, but to do it virtually and to meet those greater needs that we were seeing every day from the communities that we serve. It has been a very, very challenging time, but there is no better team anywhere in the United States than the team that I work with at the Urban League of Louisiana. And what they have shown has provided some great lessons and some great insight for us at the Urban League, and hopefully insight that we are able to share with those that we serve and the broader community. So we were able to maintain funding, but we also gained some new funding and support from funders in the private sector partners that prioritized support for racial equity work.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that, Judy, a little later. So thank you so much for that. And certainly pivoting was what we were all doing in these times. So I want to kick it to you, Elise. And I know kitsmart works in schools, bringing teaching artists into the classroom. How did kitsmart adapt, and what was the impact on your revenue?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me today. It's so great to see everyone. So kitsmart is an arts integration organization. We partner with schools to engage children and educators in dynamic and creative and relevant learning through the arts. And because of that, I have the great privilege of working with a team of creatives and artists who have great comfort with ambiguity, and also just an amazing and engaged board of directors who have been just phenomenal in the way that they have stepped up to support our staff, our artists, and our schools. When the schools shut down in March, we very, very quickly were able to get the commitment from our board that we were going to keep everyone employed, and that was the first piece of level setting that we needed to do to make sure that we were able to continue to provide the services that we needed without having an additional panic for any of the artists that we work with. Many of our artists continued working. They pivoted over to the virtual format when their partner teachers and when their partner schools pivoted over to the virtual format. We had a lot of learning curves doing these kinds of things, learning how to use our online tools, and the team just really stepped into that. So we were able to create an entire YouTube channel that is populated with amazing content created by our artists, so that when we had schools that were working asynchronously, that we were able to really move into a direction that they could use. We were able to do a lot of our professional development for classroom teachers online, and really even expand that work, because in a virtual format, we were able to go to places that we've never been able to go before, that would be prohibitive for training. So, I mean, we did workshops with teachers in Alaska and Colorado and India, all over the place. It was really pretty amazing opportunity. And really, I think that as far as the revenue side of it, 40% of our budget is earned revenue. And one of the things that happened was any after school and enrichment really dried up. So being able to expand into professional development and doing those kinds of that kind of work really kept us going, as well as the PPP. Our fundraiser was postponed, but we really wanted to make a commitment to not just keep our artists employed, but be able to pay them year round. Normally they're seasonal with us because in the summer they're doing camps and other work, but that also went away. So our board made that commitment as well, being able to have that stability for our staff and our faculty, as well as being able to provide them with some health insurance options and healthcare stipends, so that we could make sure that they were feeling supported and protected. And I would say that the other thing that we were able to do during this time that was so important was be really self-reflective. So we took this past 18 months and did a really comprehensive 5-year strategic plan. We then moved into working on an evaluation plan, so that we were really re-examining how we're measuring our impact, and redeveloping our theory of change. So it was a challenge, and I know Judy's got the best staff in town. I don't know, we might have to thumb wrestle over it, but I think that it really just shows that the folks that are in our sector are capable of doing so much in such a challenging time, and being able to kind of spin on a dime. So I really couldn't be more proud of the work that we were able to do, and the work that our sector has been able to do.
This is awesome. I really appreciate, Elise and Judy, your comments, and also just the gratitude and care that you showed for your staff and your team members. I mean, they work so hard, and we're going to talk a little bit about the impact that the pandemic and recent Hurricane Ida has had on our nonprofit staff, who essentially are first responders in a lot of this work that we're talking about. So it is clear to me that our nonprofit sector is nimble, it's responsive, it is creative. And I don't know if we always get the credit for that. So thank you for sharing those stories and demonstrating that to the folks that are with us today. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Mumford, who's going to talk about this increase in demand that we've alluded to.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So let's talk about some findings from the survey about the increased demand for their services and the increased workload that many nonprofits experienced, including those represented among our guests during the first year of the pandemic. And you can imagine that this increased need has only continued to this day following Hurricane Ida, and while the pandemic continues as well. So almost half of all nonprofits experienced increased service demand, including over 60% of human service nonprofits. And more than half expanded services to help respond to the pandemic. Nonprofits stepped up in a time of need despite the internal challenges they were facing, as you just heard. Almost half of nonprofits in our community specifically prioritize communities of color in their service delivery, and especially Black communities. And these nonprofits were even more likely to experience increased demand as the pandemic preyed on and worsened existing inequities. Because of the increased demand and simultaneous staffing crunch, nonprofits faced increased workload and stress on their staff, many of whom are part of the very same communities most harmed by the pandemic. This is especially true among nonprofits prioritizing their services to Black communities in our region. That stress has only compounded after Hurricane Ida, and as the pandemic has continued with wave after wave and additional variants. The strain on mental health is very concerning and too often results in burnout and risk of physical ailments. While half of nonprofits prioritizing services to communities of color plan to increase their staff this year in 2021, it is unclear whether they were able to move forward on those plans and fill open positions given all of the uncertainty. I'll now pass it back to Kelly and our guests to discuss how they responded to increased need for their services and demands on their staff.
Steve. Yes, nonprofit leaders have always rolled up their sleeves to get the job done. The data and the open-ended responses clearly reveal that the increase in demand for nonprofit services resulting from the pandemic has taken a toll on our nonprofit leaders. And as Steve said, burnout is a real concern. At the Greater New Orleans Foundation, we are investing in nonprofit leaders' self-care and their leadership through executive coaching and network building, and we have a lot more work to do in this area. We are also continuing to streamline our grant-making processes to reduce the burden on nonprofits so they have more time to spend in the field doing their mission work rather than grant writing and reporting. This is even more important in a disaster. Elise, all aspects of society were disrupted by the pandemic. Probably most noted were schools. Tell us a little bit about who KitsMart serves and how the pandemic impacted the demand on your services.
Yeah. Well, the impact on schools is real, but it's also ongoing. I think this is going to be something that schools are feeling for a while. And I think that we're looking at things that are not only about learning loss, but we're also looking at what are those social and emotional impacts that our students and our teachers are facing. I think that we know that burnout is real. I think that there is just so much uncertainty that it's hard sometimes to feel strong and confident when you're kind of facing all of those things, which I know our schools are facing all of the time. And teaching isn't easy to begin with, right? So I think that when we think about, how we want to serve our schools and who's in our schools, what we're really thinking about is like, what is that support network? So right now we are working, partnering very deeply with 15 different public schools in New Orleans. 90% of our kids are kids of color. 85% of them are the low socioeconomic status. And, families felt this, schools felt this, as a mom of a child who's been virtual learning, I felt it. So when we were looking at what the demand was, we really had a moment of uncertainty too, because we didn't know, moving from one school year to the next, how schools were going to respond, if they were still going to value partnerships like the ones they have with KitsMart. And it was just so exciting to see all of our schools come back to us and say, we know that there's a real need, especially in this time where we're pivoting to virtual learning where kids are online all the time, we see that there's a real need for the kind of engagement that partnerships like yours can create for our schools. And so, that additional support we were able to do I mean, we were dropping off art supply kits for individual students at schools. We were modeling how to do interactive work with students through professional development, because we were all learning this technology at the same time. And one of the things that I think that that helped us through was really kind of doubling down on both our commitment to literacy, but also to social and emotional learning. We have a free arts integrated social emotional literacy curriculum. It's on our website. Anyone can access it. And we have been re-examining that and really training our artists and bringing that into more of our classrooms. It was a need that we heard from a lot of our schools of just, we need to find new ways to connect and elevate that need with our students. And this year we have expanded to serve the most schools that we've ever served. And I think that, we see that there's been nothing great about the pandemic, but one of the things that we've seen that may be a bright spot is the pendulum may be swinging a little bit back from this accountability kind of ethos and into thinking more holistically about what we mean by student success, what our students really need in the classroom, and also how we can support the staffs that are serving them. So we are hoping that we're just going to continue to grow and that we can keep bringing these services to as many schools in New Orleans as want it.
That's awesome. And that's amazing that you increased your school partnerships during the pandemic. I mean, to me, that really demonstrates the need. And I'm wondering, Elise, before we move on to hear from Judy, you had shared in some conversation we had about how you made some of your teaching artists whole through this work. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's really important for our audience to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on it a little bit before, but our board just felt so, so committed to making sure that our faculty of teaching artists feel supported during this time, that, there are things that I think that as leaders, we really need to think about. Are we being generous with the paid time off that we're giving people? Are we being generous with the way that that we're approaching their needs for wellness? And so, being able to use PPP money so that the majority of our faculty who are not year-round employees were able to get paid salary year-round, being able to give everyone a healthcare stipend so that they are able to take care of their own needs and not have that additional burden. We've been working, I will say, even prior to the pandemic, to think about these things. Especially for our part-time staff, a lot of nonprofits who use part-time staff, they're paid on an hourly basis. And so what we've decided to do a few years ago was move to a salary basis for everyone, so that there is an expectation of income. What you're making, and that, if your school is on a 2-week break, you still are getting a paycheck. So just, I feel like there's so much more that we can do to support the people that work in our field. And so I'm really excited by talking to other nonprofit leaders and seeing how creative solutions are coming up, both through the experience we've all had with the pandemic, but also just like this real understanding that we have now of like how important that care really is.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. We talk a lot about nonprofit sustainability, and I think often we think about finance, like it's about the numbers and the budget, but without a really qualified staff that is whole and supported, our work can't be done. And that's part of sustainability too. And I am so glad again that this conversation is really rising in our sector. So
nonprofits are people, and our people are magic. So
that's exactly it. As you guys have shared throughout our webinar, Well, Judy, we know that COVID-19 had a disproportionate impact on people of color, especially Black communities. And nonprofits prioritizing services to these communities, like the Urban League, reported experiencing increased demand and increased staff workload to meet this demand. Does this track with your experiences at the Urban League? And if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Kelly, I feel like you have had cameras hidden at the Urban League of Louisiana in our headquarters, even though the majority of our team members in New Orleans and Baton Rouge have been working remotely since the start of the pandemic. We have had a core team, our chief financial officer and her team, reporting into the office, and our office managers in both locations coming into the office every day. But yes, and yes to your questions. Tremendously, really seeing an increase in the need for the services that we provide at the Urban League of Louisiana. And again, kind of going back to some of the points that I made earlier, in many ways, this is a triple pandemic for communities of color. For African Americans, we deal every day with historic racism in this country and the systems that perpetuate racism every day, the disparities that exist as a result of those systems. And so take that, then add a pandemic to it. You mentioned, Kelly, the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had health-wise on African Americans and other communities of color. And then more recently, Hurricane Ida. And so to look at all three of those, and then remembering our starting point for many of the people that we serve, it has been a really, really, really difficult time. Our team has really stepped forward to just continue to push. And there's no other way to say it. You really can't let up. You have to start immediately, which we did. And then you can't let up. You've got to be careful, though, because we are all human beings, and we are experiencing personal loss. We're experiencing other challenges within our own immediate families, our extended families, friends and neighbors. We all know that this has been a near impossible time. But again, it is the mission of the Urban League, and it is in our DNA to really step to the forefront. And so we did things like, we made sure that the communities that we serve had the information that they needed in order to really understand this world that we found ourselves in 2020. We went to the virtual format, and we did a series of webinars to really help African Americans and other communities of color really understand what it meant from a health perspective and a health equity perspective. We brought together public health officials and experts, doctors, government and policy leaders from this area across the state and across the country. We brought legislators to the table to really talk about what this would mean and what it could mean legislatively, and what kinds of policy issues we needed to make sure that we were continuing to pay attention to. We know that is our job at the Urban League of Louisiana, is to provide information on policy and also to advocate for those issues and those policies that are going to support a thriving African American community. And so we were able to do that, and I feel very, very pleased that we were able to do it. Also, Kelly, an increase again in the need for services and for programming. And so making sure that we were able to continue to provide those at an increased level and to do it virtually. Finally, I'll say we have to always make sure that we continue to listen. One of our kind of guiding principles at the Urban League of Louisiana is to be the best listeners possible. So we engage community, we listen to community, we show the highest level of respect to community, and we believe that in so doing, we are able to best serve community. If if we listen carefully and if we treat what they tell us with the highest level of respect, which means for us, turning that into programming and also leading us in terms of what we advocate for. And so we had to make sure in this virtual environment that we continued to listen. We had to make sure that we could reach people and that we continue to engage and to listen and to learn. And to your earlier point, Kelly, to be nimble. We had to remain nimble. We had to remain flexible. So as we were learning about what the needs were, we were able to support those needs. The Greater New Orleans Foundation was one of our many partners who provided us with face coverings to be able to offer to the community. And for a solid year, once a month from our headquarters in New Orleans mostly, and then sometimes in Baton Rouge, we were able to provide face coverings. We knew we had to get into the business of providing face coverings because we were hearing from the communities that we serve that the cost of face coverings was cost prohibitive for them. So we had to find those partnerships. We had to make sure that we could provide those face coverings so that people could stay protected. And so those are just some of the examples and some of the ways that we had to respond to the increased need, new needs. These were needs that we were not expecting all of the time. And then also, again, and I can't do it enough, just applaud the individuals that I work with at the Urban League of Louisiana. Our board of directors made it clear to us as well. This was an easy and quick conversation. We must be the Urban League. We must meet our mission. There's no better time, and the need is as great as it will ever be. And so we had to make sure that we figured out what we needed to do in order to be able to serve.
Yeah, this is awesome. I'm just smiling because I'm hearing Elise saying we were delivering art kits. And then I hear Judy talk about we were delivering face coverings, listening to your constituents and then delivering the services that were going to meet them where they were and what they needed. And that's what nonprofits do every day. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Steve, and he's going to share some of our findings regarding the racial equity in the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So finally, and perhaps most importantly of all, the study explored racial equity in our region's nonprofit leadership and funding opportunities. We found that compared to census data on the racial demographics of our region's inhabitants overall, people of color are underrepresented among nonprofit executive directors, as well as board chairs, board members, and executive teams, basically all the groups that lead and govern nonprofits in our region and elsewhere. So this leadership gap is especially large within arts and culture nonprofits. The gap is similar to the one found in urban areas nationwide this year by a national study, and it's similar to findings in our region a decade ago from a study by the Urban Institute. This gap has real implications for equitable service delivery because executive directors of color are more likely to lead nonprofits that provide direct services in response to the pandemic, especially to communities of color most harmed by it, and that advocate on behalf of these communities for public awareness and policy change. In other words, leaders of color are, by and large, relatively more attuned to racial inequities confronting communities of color and the strategies needed to address them in the short and long terms. It was a bit encouraging that 60% of respondents to our survey shared specific changes they're making in their nonprofits to promote racial equity, such as establishing more inclusive policies and more culturally competent recruitment and hiring practices. But cultural and structural changes take time, resources, and persistence, and many nonprofits stated that they need support in this area. Nonprofits with leaders of color faced funding disadvantages coming into the pandemic. Specifically, while executives of color lead 28% of the nonprofits in our region, They hold just 13% of total assets, which represents the wealth accumulated by their nonprofit organization. So put differently, on average, white-led nonprofits have almost $2.50 of assets for every $1 held by nonprofits with leaders of color. And remember, our study excluded the very largest nonprofits like universities and hospitals that hold the most assets in our region. Further, nonprofits with leaders of color were less likely to receive critical PPP loans from federally backed banks to support their pandemic adaptations and response, although a majority of all nonprofits still did receive these critical loans. Partly because of this disparity in financial cushion, as well as the greater demand on their services during the pandemic, by winter 2021, nonprofits with executive directors of color had enough flexible operating reserves to cover a full 2 months fewer expenses on average than white-led nonprofits. They were, in other words, they were operating on thinner margins despite the increased demand, which further increases the stress and uncertainty that they were dealing with. There is a bright spot in this picture. Almost a third of nonprofits with leaders of color were able to actually increase their budget from spring 2020 to winter 2021 when we did our second survey, in part by gaining access to new or increased funding sources in 2020, and especially through grants from private foundations. This is a hopeful trend, but it obviously was not enough to eliminate existing funding disparities, and it remains to be seen whether foundations and donors will continue to target their support towards nonprofit leaders and communities of color, or if their priorities will turn elsewhere as they have done in the past, especially after disasters. I'll now pass it back one last time to Kelly and our guests to discuss their perspectives on racial equity in our regional nonprofit sector. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And we are so encouraged that this very important conversation is one that's on the table and that nonprofits really want to dive into. And so, Elise, how is kitsmart thinking about diversity and equity?
Yeah, I mean, as a white leader of an organization that serves primarily children of color, I'm thinking about this constantly. I think about something that one of my mentors said to me just about the work that we do in general, and it's that we have to understand the marginality of the arts and schools as a dimension of institutional racism, because a major form of oppressing and marginalizing people is by limiting forms of expression. And so one of the things that I think about when I'm thinking about equity is obviously thinking about the diversity of the people that we're working with, but also making sure that we're really thinking about our pedagogy. You know, as we have worked over the years to really get a strong board of directors that represents the schools we serve, the more that our footprint increases, the more we need to also work on diversifying that board, right? So as we've been increasing the number of schools we work with, especially in New Orleans East, we really need to be thinking about how we are thinking about that with our board and staff, you know, Latinx and Asian folks that we need to really have their voices at the table in a way that we haven't in the past. We've been able to, through funding from Great New Orleans Foundation, work on the pipeline for getting more artists of color and Native to Southeast Louisiana into classrooms through our homegrown program, where we're doing training and creating that pipeline for people, for teaching artists that want to do that work. And then the other thing that we've been thinking about is like, how do we want to broaden our understanding of equity and diversity? And one of the things that we see in public schools are a lot of students with special needs. So we need to be thinking also about disability justice. We this year hired a full-time special education specialist to work with us to help us make sure that we're thinking about our best way of like really reaching all learners. And I'm also really excited because we're going to be part of Beloved Communities Equity in Schools cohort this year. So our board and staff will participate in that. And create hopefully a really robust operationalized plan to overlay with all of that intensive strategic planning work that we've been working on, because I don't think that we can do all of these things discreetly, right? We need to integrate all of those pieces together to make sure that that we are having that reflective, holistic experience for the for ourselves internally and for the communities we serve, and really thinking about equity for, like I said, for all of the learners that we serve. So so yeah, it's been a lot of work trying to think about what all of those pieces and parts look like, but like I said, we have an amazing team and amazing partners who are doing such great work in this field that that through like listening and learning, I'm feeling optimistic about how we're able to move forward.
Yeah, this is great. And you're right. When we hear from our nonprofits, they often talk about how do we operationalize this? So congratulations to KitsMart and good luck with your cohort. And I look forward to hearing about it. So Judy, as the public conversation around racial inequity and racism amplified, the study certainly shows there was an increase in funding for some Black-led nonprofits, especially in the form of new and increased private grants. And you alluded to that a little bit early in our conversation. And I know that the Urban League was one of the Greater New Orleans Foundation's first racial equity grantees. And in 2021 alone, the foundation awarded $1 million to Black-led nonprofits through our Greater Together Racial Equity Fund. So how did the spotlight on racial equity impact your funding? If you can talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Certainly, organizations in the racial equity space absolutely, I think, did benefit from foundations and corporations that prioritize racial equity. And the Urban League of Louisiana indeed did gain some new support and some new partnerships. And that has been important. It has allowed us to be able to advance work that is very important to our mission. Again, thank you to the Greater New Orleans Foundation for your support of our Sea Change initiative, which, as you know, Kelly, is our initiative focused on the Greater New Orleans area that focuses on closing the racial wealth gap for African Americans, Hispanics, and Latinos. We're using a collective impact model, so we have a number of partners that we're building a strategy with, and we will operationalize that strategy starting in 2022. It will be a multi-year effort, so we're hoping that the Greater New Orleans Foundation and others will continue to support that work, but we know how critical it is to keep that work going. I mentioned that example because it is also critical for funders and partners to continue to support Black-led organizations who are in the racial equity space. One-time funding is just that. It's once. It will be used well. Obviously, we are excellent stewards of funding at the Urban League of Louisiana, as are most nonprofit organizations, excellent stewards of the funds that they receive. But it is critical if we really believe in racial equity and we really want to prioritize racial equity, and not just prioritize it, but actually see the benefit of the results of prioritizing racial equity, then we must continue to support the work. This is not a moral imperative. This is a smart and strategic economic decision. We know the data is clear on this point, that when we close disparity gaps, that everyone does better, not just those who have been historically marginalized, but the entire economy becomes stronger. Everyone in society does better. And we have no idea what the power and the promise of doing this work looks like, because we've never done it. But I believe that it goes beyond our wildest dreams and our wildest expectations. And so I'm really, really hopeful that we've seen just enough in this time. You know, again, if there are any positives to be pulled from this pandemic, that we can look at putting a spotlight on this issue, not being afraid to talk about it, not being afraid to invest in it, and to do the work that is necessary to address it, and continue and come up with strategic, sustainable solutions so that we can all get to a space like we have never seen, but what I really believe is the best that we could ever imagine for all of us.
Oh my gosh, Judy, what a great way to sort of end our webinar. And this is just the beginning of the conversation. And you're right. Will this be sustained? Will philanthropy and the donor community continue to make these investments? And as you said, we are nowhere near closing the gap, but we see the power of the potential. And I am so excited to continue this journey with you and all of our nonprofit colleagues to move forward and really do the good work that we're meant to do, and to have the self-agency and the resources that we need to do that work. So thank you, Judy, Elise, and Dr. Mumford. I am sure there are so many more stories that you can tell us to bring this data alive. And we are looking forward to many conversations on how we can use this data to support the nonprofit sector thrive and become more equitable. We at the Greater New Orleans Foundation, we will make good on our promise to nonprofits. We are energized and we are so hopeful for their potential and their great work. And in these times of greatest challenge, our nonprofits came through for our community, and our commitment to them must be just as steadfast. So to our attendees, we hope that you will use this study to learn more about the nonprofit sector, their challenges, their opportunities. And in the new year, we will be hosting additional webinars specifically for nonprofits and for the foundation and donor community to dive into this data a little bit deeper, make meaning of the data, and really bring it to life so that we can make change in our own policies and practices. Data is not meant to be on the shelf. It's meant to be used. And that is our goal with this particular study. So we will continue to seek out opportunities to learn more from our nonprofits, to guide us, to guide our partners throughout the region and nation about how we can best support our nonprofits. So I just want to thank you for spending your time with us today. We really appreciate your interest in the study. There is a QR code on the screen. You can use that code with your phone to download the study. There is also a link that you can access the study. We will also be releasing it via press release and a blog. And since you attended this webinar, you will also receive that. So again, thank you so much for spending your precious time with us. Thank you, Judy, Elise, and Dr. Mumford again. And I really hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.